November 2006 does not arrive with fireworks. In Quebec, a public account that has been open since the mid-1970s finally prints a zero. No athletes take a lap, no anthem plays. A special provincial tobacco tax has done the unglamorous work for 3 decades, pulling small sums from a habit and feeding them into an Olympic hangover. Montreal has not declared bankruptcy. Buses still run, the river still walks with ice. The city has simply lived with a bill that outlasted children born in the year of the flame. Those games lasted 16 days. This August, the FIH Hockey World Cup has people asking again what it costs to invite the world. Venues, security, hotels, compounds of cameras. The older answer is already poured on a hillside in Montreal's East End, a vast concrete ellipse whose silhouette still argues with the sky. The Olympic Stadium. On the street, it carries another name, the Big O. July 17th, 1976. The bowl fills. Jean Drapeau, the mayor who won the prize, has already offered a sentence that will outlive his speeches. The Olympics, he said, can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. It is theater. It is also a fiscal claim. Self-financing. No hangover. A festival that pays for its own stage. The stage does not cooperate. When the fire goes out, the public debt attached to the project sits near $1.5 billion. The inclined tower meant to hoist a retractable roof is not finished. The roof, as designed, is not there. What television sells as a completed host city is, in the ledgers, an open construction file with interest already moving. The contradiction is not that sport costs money. It is that a municipal boast, spoken as if physics itself forbade red ink, became a nicotine levy that ran into the winter of 2006. 16 days of medals, 30 years of receipts. The question is mechanical. Who signed? What broke? And why the public, not the spectacle, carried the weight? The wound begins 6 years earlier, in a room that smells of diplomacy rather than wet cement. On May 12, 1970, in Amsterdam, the International Olympic Committee awards the 1976 Summer Games to Montreal. Moscow and Los Angeles lose. For a French-speaking metropolis that has spent the 1960s forcing itself onto the map, the vote feels like confirmation. Montreal has just hosted Expo 67. The islands in the St. Lawrence still hold the memory of pavilions and crowds. Officials treat that World's Fair as proof that grandeur can be scheduled, ticketed, and survived. That is the blind spot. Expo was a World's Fair with a different risk shape. The Olympics demand purpose-built theaters of concrete, finished to a day the planet has already circled in ink. Drapeau's early public arithmetic is almost casual. A figure in the neighborhood of $124 million is allowed to travel as if it were a budget. More formal organizing estimates later settle near $310 million. Even that larger number assumes a decade that will not arrive. It assumes calm prices, obedient labor, and a stadium that behaves like a stadium, not like a prototype. The chosen ground is not a postcard downtown. It is Hochelaga Maisonneuve, an East End working district along Pi 9, where an Olympic park is supposed to rise as both civic gift and machine. Main stadium, velodrome, swimming center, a village for athletes. The cluster is meant to look inevitable, a single gesture in pale concrete. Inevitability is a design mood. It is not a cash flow. Then the 1970s do what the 1970s do. The 1973 oil shock slams import costs. Canadian inflation climbs into double digits. Steel, cement, and wages stop being numbers you can hold still on a briefing page. A 6-year build calendar, already tight for an unprecedented structure, now runs through a labor market that knows the date on the invitation cannot move. Every delay becomes leverage. Every change order becomes a second budget hiding inside the first. Ottawa watches with a cold eye. Pierre Trudeau's federal government does not rush to treat the Games as a national blank check. The Olympics are framed, in the early years, as a municipal prize with provincial consequences. That allocation of responsibility will matter more than any opening ceremony speech. When costs jump, the first political reflex is not shared sacrifice. It is an argument about whose books should bleed. What most recaps miss is that the fortnight itself is not the failure. Tickets sell. Events happen. Nadia Comaneci will score a perfect 10 in the forum and give the broadcast a permanent souvenir. The operational games can look like success, while the capital works are already a wreck. The public rarely separates those two ledgers. A host is judged on whether the show starts. The city is judged later on whether the buildings ever stop charging rent to the treasury. By 1973, construction is no longer a plan. It is a race against a calendar written in Europe in 1970 on the assumption that Montreal's recent fair had taught the city how to invent the future on time. The future, this time, is an inclined tower and a roof that has never been proven at this scale in this climate. The bid committee sold a festival. The city bought a research and development project and called it a venue. That substitution, quiet on the day of the vote, is the entire later disaster in miniature. Follow the mayor, because the design is his hunger given a silhouette. Jean Drapeau has already used Expo to turn Montreal into a sentence other capitals have to finish. He wants the games the way some men want a cathedral, not as a service, as a proof. Self-finance is not, for him, a spreadsheet. It is a personality. If the city looks as if it doubts, the city looks small. So he does not shop for a cheap bowl. He shops for an object no other host will own. The object arrives with a French passport. Roger Taillibert, architect of Paris's Parc des Princes, offers organic concrete, a vast ellipse, and a 165-meter inclined tower that is supposed to work as a crane. From that mast, a retractable roof will theoretically slide over the field like a living skin. The tower will be the tallest inclined structure of its kind. The roof will make weather optional. In presentations, the building is a machine for climate. In contracts, it is a sequence of custom pieces, many imagined for a European shop and a milder sky. Taillibert's incentive is purity. A masterpiece cannot be value engineered into a dull circle without ceasing to be the thing that justified the plane ticket. Drapeau's incentive is immortality with a ribbon on it. Contractor's incentive is time. Every frozen month, every revised drawing is a claim. Construction unions, hardened by a decade of public megaprojects, see a completion date that cannot slip without humiliating the country on live television. That is not a wage negotiation. That is a hostage situation with bleachers. Robert Bourassa's Quebec government sits one layer above the mayor's theater. The premier does not need a sculpture. He needs a province that does not become a punchline. When site reports turn from optimistic to physical, the province's motive shifts from blessing the festival to seizing it. In 1975, the government creates the Régie des Installations Olympiques and pulls the works out of purely municipal hands. It is a life-or-death administrative decision, dressed as project management. Either Quebec takes the concrete, or July 1976 opens on a crater. A second decision is more stubborn. They do not kill the tower. They do not replace the dream roof with a lid a northern contractor already knows how to build. Simplifying would confess that the original bet was vanity. So the city keeps the shape that will make postcards and the mechanism that will make debt. Ambition stays photogenic. Constraint is postponed into the winter after the tourists leave. The people who will pay are not in the room. They are not even yet a tax category. They are whoever can be made to fund a building that has already become too famous to cancel. The site begins to fail in ordinary ways that become extraordinary because the clock is cruel. Through 1974 and 1975, strikes stall cranes over Hochelaga Maisonneuve. Prefabricated pieces imagined in French shops arrive into a Canadian inflation spiral and wait in yards while jurisdictions argue about who commands the poor. Winter does not care about the IOC. Concrete has a temperature, so does patience. The stadium's early cost class, spoken of near $134 million, becomes a museum label. Change orders stack. The unique geometry refuses to be bid like a warehouse. Each delay feeds the next. Idle equipment, renegotiated labor, storage, redesign, overtime that is no longer a choice.
The régie, once created, does what emergency authorities do. It spends to hit a date. Hitting a date is not the same as finishing a building. Summer 1976 arrives anyway. Walk the unfinished giant in present tense. Athletes enter a bowl that can hold a ceremony, which is the only test the broadcast will apply. Look up. The mast that was supposed to dominate the skyline is a stump of intention. There is no working retractable skin. Temporary arrangements keep rain and cameras in a truce.
The games proceed. That is the cruelest success. Because the show starts, the political system can tell itself the crisis was operational, not structural. Then the visitors fly home, and the structure remains, incomplete, already expensive, and now too public to abandon. Interest does not take a fortnight off. Quebec and Montreal now hold a capital wound that must be serviced, whether anyone buys another ticket. The municipal balance sheet cannot swallow the whole thing without choking services, so the burden climbs to the province. This is the first quiet mechanism, not a bankruptcy court, a transfer. The city keeps its name on the postcards. The wider tax base takes the duration. The second mechanism is the dedicated vice. Quebec attaches a special tobacco tax to the Olympic residue. The genius, if you want a cold word, is inelastic demand. A smoker does not refinance a mortgage because the levy on a pack moves. The stream is politically easier than a visible property assessment labeled stadium. It converts a glamorous failure into 1,000 tiny, almost private transactions at corner stores. Households experience it as the price of a habit.
The Treasury experiences it as debt service. For 30 years, the two descriptions share a cash register. Work on the corpse of the dream continues after the medals. The tower is not completed until 1987, 11 years after the opening ceremony it was built to crown. A first high-tech roof is finally installed that same late decade, a fabric gesture toward the original fantasy. It does not become a climate machine. It tears. Snow loads teach physics that brochures skipped. Events are canceled or moved. A replacement lid will be argued and paid for in later rounds, long after anyone can pretend the feature was a revenue engine. Meanwhile, the building tries to earn its keep, and mostly teaches a different lesson. The Montreal Expos play baseball in a room designed as an Olympic theater. Concerts come and go. A Grey Cup, a trade show, a monster truck weekend. The classic afterlife of a venue whose seating capacity and operating costs were sized for a planet, not a neighborhood. Attendance cannot cover the heat, the staff, the inspections, the peculiar maintenance of a one-off mast. This is the white elephant pattern in its clean form. Too famous to dynamite, too specialized to fill.
Too costly to idle, too costly to run. Demolition is not a serious fiscal plan. Imploding a landmark of that mass next to transit and housing would be another mega project with its own lawsuits. So the elephant stays. The régie remains a permanent institution, which is another kind of cost. A bureaucracy whose reason for existing is a building that was supposed to be a 16-day stage. Annual reports replace opening speeches. The question stops being, will it be ready? The question becomes, which roof, which season, which subsidy? Compounding does the rest. Principle from the 1970s is not the whole story. Time multiplies whatever you refuse to kill. Officials can announce pieces of good news, an event booked, a tourist figure, a refurbished concourse, while the dedicated tax keeps walking in the background like a person who never left the party. When the Olympic account is finally cleared in that gray month of 2006, the political class will speak as if a story has ended. It has not. The levee's purpose ends. The concrete does not. Inspections continue. Closure threats continue.
A new skin will still be debated in the 2010s because gravity and ultraviolet light did not sign the payoff papers. Leave the wound open on purpose. The fortnight was real. The debt service was real. The building still occupies the East End sky like a billboard for a product the city can no longer return. Idealism said the festival would mint its own fortune. Reality said a prototype in an inflation decade would mint a tax category. Between those two sentences sits every later host's temptation to treat a calendar as if it were collateral. Stand far enough above ply ninth, and the lesson is not a sermon about athletes. It is a mismatch of clocks. A global tournament is a spasm of attention. A stadium is a 50-year industrial object. When a mayor is allowed to fund the object with the language of the spasm, self-financing, once in a lifetime, the world is watching, the public is conscripted into a duration it never auditioned for. The quiet mystery here is not a conspiracy in a smoke-filled box. It is a legal and fiscal translation. Prestige enters as a speech. It leaves as a dedicated stream on a receipt. Smokers did not vote on a roof geometry. They inherited a category because their purchases were regular enough to pacify bondholders. That is how a 16-day international spectacle becomes a generation of ordinary taxation without anyone needing to call it a collapse of the city. Other hosts will keep making the same temporal error in new materials. They will publish legacy reports with walking paths and hotel nights. Some of those benefits are real. They are also the wrong unit.
The right unit is who holds the tail risk when a signature design meets a labor market, a weather system, and a completion date that cannot slip. If the answer is a vice tax, a tourist levy, or a quiet shift from city to province, the festival has already chosen its losers. They will not be on the podium. The ellipse still sits there, pale and enormous, a machine that never quite became the climate device it sold, a landmark that cannot be wished back into a meadow. Children who were not alive for the opening have paid, smoked, or walked past it on the metro without needing the original boast explained. That is the aftertaste of public ambition that refuses a cheaper shape. The building outlives the excuse, and the excuse becomes infrastructure. So the last image is not a medal. It is a winter evening, a pack on a counter, a few extra cents that once had a destination printed in the province's mind. The destination was a tower and a roof and a promise that red ink was biologically impossible. The cents kept moving long after the promise had become a joke with a nickname.
If a city can mortgage a generation of small purchases for a fortnight of flags, who exactly should be allowed to sign?